Tilea's Troubles, Part 119. Twice, thrice, and many more shall I kill, slaughter, and never look upon thy face. A battle report. South of Campogrotta, summer 2404. The first of the Uomini Ratto to arrive within sight of the river were Gisellas. They hefted their burdensome barrels and pervases to the top of a small hill, from where they could see the bridge, the tollkeeper's cottage, and a body of mercenary crossbowmen guarding the place. The enemy had obviously been forewarned of their approach, as they were formed up in an orderly manner, and sheltered behind their own pervases, some of which were painted with their company's emblem, which was also visible on the little ensign fluttering in the breeze above them. Lord Urlak had sent the Gisellas with exactly such a target in mind. His orders were clear. They were to kill any enemies who might threaten the annihilation bombard with missiles, and do so as quickly as possible. Of all the forces available to him, Lord Urlak must have thought them best able to do so, due to the range of their long pieces and the potency of their warpstone bullets. Annoyingly, however, the two companies of Gisellas had been ordered to advance separately, to cover a wider area. This first company, 5 in number, saw immediately that the crossbowmen were numerous enough that it could take considerable time to drive them off, time in which the enemy might shoot their own weapons at the engine. Their concerns were not dissimilar to those of the other Gisellas, far to the right of them, who had similarly crested a hill, and from which they descried a body of horsemen. The riders were one of the several companies of light horse that had been continuously circumnavigating the city of Campogrotta, presumably because the enemy commander suspected an attack was imminent. Of practical necessity, the horsemen carried lighter crossbows than their foot counterparts, but their mobility meant they could move quicker and closer to bring them to bear. So it was that the leader of this second company was also cursing the decision to divide the Gisellas. Still, knowing what else was approaching to guard the engine, the Gisellas knew that the situation was nowhere near as bad as it could have been. They apparently faced only 30 or so light troops, nothing like an army. Campogrotta possessed considerable forces, of both men and dwarfs, and if even half its strength had been brought to bear here, the annihilation bombard would never have got close enough to launch its deadly burden. Perhaps Lord Urlak's plan to draw the enemy's attention northwards to Buldio had worked. Despite the recent death of the underworld emissary he had infiltrated into Campogrotta city, the remaining spies and assassins who had assisted the emissary still had considerable influence on the criminal fraternities of Campogrotta, most importantly in the form of debts they could call in to command their collaborators to commit arson and stir up riots in Buldio. Once the town was burning, then it mattered not whether the enemy mistakenly believed Urlak's assault had begun there, or instead recognised the truth that violent unrest and fiery rebellion had broken out. For either way, they would be sufficiently distracted to take their eyes off the southern approaches. And, considering Lord Urlak's army was last known to have captured Rivola in the north, it was doubtful that very many eyes were looking south in the first place. Below the first company of Gisellas, the horde of slaves now moved towards the bridge. Just like the rest of the army, the slaves had marched ahead of the engine throughout the long journey there. If the engine had moved in the vanguard through the underpass, then its poisonous passage in such an enclosed space would have so corrupted the tunnel that it was unlikely even one warrior or slave would have emerged. Here, however, above ground, there was another reason for the slaves' advanced positioning. It was intended that their sheer weight of numbers would block and hold off any enemies attempting to reach the engine. Lord Urlak had given considerable thought to the matter of who exactly to send ahead with the bombard. No one had been surprised when he included the slaves in the escort. This was exactly the sort of task such despised, disposable and desperate troops were best suited for. As they approached the river, all the chains had been removed from their wrist shackles, and resharpened blades had been distributed liberally amongst them. They were told the enemy was weak and easy to kill, unworthy of the attention of the rest of the army, and that once defeated, they would be freely permitted to feast on the enemy's flesh as a reward. The half-starved slaves now moved with an alacrity never before witnessed, chattering and salivating in equal measure, and in so large a mob that it was difficult to imagine anything could get through them. On the right of the line, although not as far out as the 2nd Giselle Company, the remnant of the once large Plague Monk Regiment advanced between 2 clumps of trees, the sun behind them. Despite having been badly mauled when taking the walls at Rivola, rather than perturbing them, the experience seemed only to make them more keen for battle. The bells on their standard, and borne by their musician, clanged, interspersed with cymbal crashes as and when the musician thought fit. Lord Urlak had apparently decided that at less than half their original strength they were no longer particularly useful to his main army, and so ordered them to join the dangerously unstable engine's escort. If they perished, he had been heard to say, then it would be like finishing off an already wounded beast of burden, and so no great loss. He simply intended to get some good use out of them before they died. At the centre of the ragged line trundled the Annihilation Bombard, accompanied as ever by half a dozen mask-wearing attendants, scuttling busily around it to ensure its smooth progress. They were a little less active now, for they were approaching the moment it would finally fire, as well as drawing close to the enemy. Clutching bared blades, they understood that on this last stretch of their journey, defending their ward from attackers should be their priority. And then, when the engine reached the riverside, which the engineers had deemed was just close enough to the city to launch the grenado, they would be needed to assist in its firing. The city-killing bomb it contained was as unstable as it had ever been, for with every moment that passed it only ever broiled some more. Indeed, in the dark tunnel, and even last night under the light of the moon, the attendants had noticed the huge iron barrel enclosing the grenado had begun to glow with the etheric heat of its burden. The engine itself looked as new as the day it was built, however, for such was the poison and heat it gave off that neither mould nor rust were able to find a foothold. For a week now, the driver, the last of a succession of such, had not left the seat at the heart of the wheel that pushed the bombard. Not only was there no one left to replace him, or just to work a shift, but most of his bones had become almost wholly fused in place. He had long since realised he was, effectively, already dead, somehow sitting astride the seam between the mortal realm and the afterlife, having not quite fully slipped across. The bright light of the sun seemed to spur the engine on. One of the frontmost attendants bore a sharp-edged shovel, which, as well as being necessary to smooth the ground, would now, if required, be utilised as a weapon, while the other bore a staff tipped with an ancient, once almost completely sapped, warpstone shard, which, in the mysteriously sympathetic manner of magical attraction, was able to draw off some of the stray energies emanating from the engine so that the attendants might survive that little bit longer. And it had apparently worked, for now it glowed brightly, like a shard of sky stone fallen fresh from the heavens, brimming with the arcane energy it had leached over the last months. Its bearer was, in his own increasingly addled way, fascinated to see what it would do if employed as a weapon. Inevitably, the engine's guard regiment marched close by, every warrior garbed similarly to the attendants, though bristling with many more blades. This was their moment, of course, and they had to be here. Thanks to their waxed robes, as well as their brass and copper filtration tanks, they alone could march close to the engine without succumbing to its deadly aura, without blood pouring from blinded eyes, without their bones melding or their muscles withering to naught, without their lungs crumbling into dust or their hearts shrivelling into dry husks. As they approached the river, their commander, the warlock engineer Goltramic, strode in the front rank, clutching his novel firework and bent under the weight of the massive copper contraption upon his back, part of which powered his experimental weapon, while the rest fed flavoured air to his lungs. He glanced about him, at the engine, at the regiments in the line, and at the enemy up ahead. This fight was to be the culmination of all that he had worked for many a month, so he wanted to get it right. It now dawned on him, despite the safety any Uomini Ratto naturally felt when part of a mob, that he was not in the right spot. He had to be able to move nimbly, to spot, target and launch his rocket at anything that threatened the engine, wherever they came from, whilst also directing both the guard and the engine as changing circumstances required. So he made his way to the regiment's flank, then stepped out alone. The huge mob of slaves and the deadly Jezzails on the hill would surely prove sufficient to guard the engine's left. But here on the right, with woods up ahead concealing he knew not what, and a cottage which might also harbour some unseen foe, he would have to be ready to react quickly. This was how the engine and its escort approached the river upon the southern outskirts of Campogrotta. If the Annihilation Bombard successfully reached the river's edge and launched its burden without mishap, then the entire population of Campogrotta, as well as the army within, would be destroyed. What a glorious way to defeat the foe! Being the nimblest body upon the field, it was the enemy's horsemen who first came up, making directly for the bombard, an apparently impetuous move which suggested that they must surely possess more than an inkling of the war machine's terrible potential. The trees, however, still concealed the bombard from the riders, so it was only the foot crossbowmen by the bridge who let loose their quarrels. These reached the engine, but with no noticeable effect, other than to clatter off this and that part, and to pepper the ground about it with fletched stubs. Not one had struck an attendant. The engineer on the rear platform, whose job in directing the engine in battle had become incrementally more important as the driver's miserable condition further deteriorated, was much encouraged by this turn of events, and now wondered whether his engine might be able to roll straight up to the bridge, where the paved surface would surely provide a reassuringly firm footing for its firing. Glancing left, he saw the slaves, and this made up his mind. Despite their many deficiencies, the slaves' great number would surely make them capable of thwarting any aggressive moves by the crossbowmen. And so he endeavoured to maintain the bombard's current bearing, which was achieved so neatly that it remained perfectly in line with the rest of the advancing army. Due to the trees, the engineer knew nothing of the enemy horse galloping obliquely across the field, but Galtramick could see them plainly. It was obvious they were making for the bombard, and he knew that could not be allowed. Even if they were unable to reach it, or harm it with their shots, simply forcing it to change course, or merely to jolt or shudder once too often, could have catastrophic results. Hefting his rocket launcher, he knew this was his moment. He had one chance, and he would not let it slip by. As a single rider fell to what was presumably a shot from the second company of Jezzails, Galtramick turned to aim at a spot just ahead of the horseman's current path, then yanked at the trigger that would spin a serrated steel wheel against a lump of pyrites to birth a shower of sparks, while at the same moment the clawed fingers of his other hand curled around the release lever. Raising the muzzle to what felt like the correct height, he squeezed hard, and whoosh! As the rocket arced away at a most satisfactory angle, Galtramick noticed several horsemen look upwards in fear, pulling hard on their reins. They were too late, however, for the rocket thumped into the ground almost in their midst and exploded in a great ball of fire. The three surviving riders could do little more but cling to their panicked horses as they fled towards and then across the river. One was swept away by the waters, so that only two gained the far side, from where both raced off towards the city. As they departed, several other enemies arrived. Both of the other light horse companies had received word of the force approaching the river and had galloped post-haste to the bridge. The second company of mounted Campania crossbowmen were already upon the southern side of the river, and so came from the Ratmen's left, while Perrette and her Brabançon riders arrived along the road leading from the city directly to the bridge. Another, considerably slower component of the Campogrottan forces also arrived upon the northern bank of the river, being one of the two dwarven artillery pieces. The dwarven crew had already been making their way to the bridge, ordered to assist in the guarding of that approach, and would have arrived at that moment anyway. The fiery wizard, Perrette, enchanted staff in hand, boldly led her riders onto the bridge, intending to waste not one moment of time in assaulting the engine, howsoever she could. The clattering of horses' hooves off the stone was louder even than the grinding clunk-clunk of the engine. The Campania's riders were somewhat more cautious, however, arriving as they had much closer to the enemy. They slowed a little, their commander hoping to assess the enemy's disposition before he got too near. Despite the slaves' presence, the hulking bombard was clearly visible to them, and so they slowed some more, the better to span their light crossbows and load their quarrels. The dwarfen cannon crew cursed, as they could not see the enemy's terror engine, and so could not target it. All the riders, however, were closing upon it as best they could. As those at the front of the Brabançon company pulled arrows from the quivers attached to their saddles, Perrette could sense the bombard's arcane power, perceiving how the winds of magic were perturbed by it, coiling chaotically in contrary eddies in its vicinity, and, in places, some distance away too. She also knew what the huge barrel, its muzzle steeply elevated, must mean. This was some sort of mortar, and whatever it fired would surely be much more deadly than any ordinary grenado. As hastily as she could, she conjured a fireball to hurl at it, but then, as she watched its strength wane as it coursed across the air to wash ineffectually over the foe, she cursed her impetuousness. A small part of the magic she had summoned had slipped from her control, and now rushed back, burning, to strike at her. She gasped at the searing pain, and might well have fallen from her mount had not one of her companions reached out to steady her, asking, "My lady, what ails thee?" At the same moment, the companions' riders loosed their quarrels at the engine, while the frontmost of the Brabançon did likewise with their arrows. Yet, all to no effect. The foot crossbow, however, had been taking their time. Now that the bombard was closer, they had a better measure of it. When they shot again, half the war engine's attendants fell, pierced deep with steel-tipped bolts, while several quarrels tore into the machine wheel, there to be crunched apart by the spin of its workings. The engineer upon the rear plate heard a quarrel speed within a hair's breadth of his ear, then another clang from his filter tank. This, the dead attendants, and the sudden arrival of several more enemy companies, one of which was thundering across the bridge straight at him, quickly changed his mind about his present course. Screeching so loudly that even the dismally distracted driver would hear, he pulled as hard as he could on the rudder wheel's auxiliary whipstaff, so that the engine turned sharply to the right to begin moving beside the trees. Despite such a manoeuvre being desperately dangerous, in that the bombard might topple, he knew the alternative was worse. The turn was successful, yet so sharp that rather like a ship changing tack badly, the bombard's speed was much reduced, and it only barely managed to gain the concealment of the trees. The engineer still intended to reach the river, but would now aim for the grassy ground further along from the bridge, which was currently bereft of enemies who might hinder his mechanical ward's progress. The journey to the place from which the bombard could fire would take longer, but he had no real choice in the matter. To continue his previous tack would have meant another heavy shower of arrows and bolts, which would surely mean the bombard's demise. Goltramick, meanwhile, was also screeching, and signalling with his now rocketless tube, ordering the guard regiment towards the bridge. If the machine was to reach the river's edge, then the riders could not be allowed to reach it. The slaves also moved on, surging like a tide toward the crossbowmen, and Goltramick cursed, for their continued advance had left a way through behind them for the mounted crossbowmen. Glancing at the Giselles on the hill, he doubted they could deliver sufficient punishment to stop the riders, and so he spun around to shout toward the plague monks. They would have to turn and head this way, the better to block any horsemen who got around the slaves. Reforming as quickly as they could, the monks moved as he commanded. Satisfied, Goltramick took a breath, and tasted the acrid smoke still curling from the muzzle of his rocket tube. Then something caught his eye, something shiny over by the cottage. Squinting as his eyes adjusted from looking into the sun, he could see an armoured man-thing had stepped out of the building's rear doorway with a great sword in his hands. "No, no!" he hissed, as he realised this was a new threat to the engine. Then stepped forwards through the trees, knowing that only he was left to thwart this particular enemy. Not for the first time, he cursed the fact that despite asking for 2 rockets, he had been given but 1. Distracted and angry as he was, he did not know that the Giselles on the right of the line had moved down from the hill, were no longer able to see any enemies, while the Giselles on the left had missed the crossbow horsemen completely. Upon the far side of the river, Entering the field with a flamboyant fluttering of flags, the largest regiment of the Compagnia del Sole, the halberdiers, marched on. They bore their enchanted banner, blessed by the goddess Myrmidia. Apart from their armour, both leather and steel, they were clothed in the company's maroon and blue, some sporting the Myrmidian white baton and yellow half-sun emblem that was also emblazoned upon their standard. Leading them, and carrying an older, smaller but more precious banner, the oldest in the company and the army standard, was Marshal Luigi Esposito, General Mazzolini's second in command. He had been left to govern the city while the general led the relief force to Buldio, and so it was he who first heard from the scouting riders of the enemy's approach from the south. A small man, he had proved himself in battle on many an occasion, reputation encouraged, if not solely enabled, by his famously magical armour. Time and time again, blows that ought to have severed his arm or even decapitated him had proved jarringly ineffective. On this occasion, however, his urge to reach the river quickly had been so pressing he had forgone the buckling of his leg armour and left his helmet lying in his chamber. Not so Captain Venusto, the fully steel carapaced fellow who had stepped boldly from the bridge-keeper's cottage. The captain raised his visor momentarily to look at Marshal Esposito, waved, and then slammed it shut again, before charging headlong at the warlock engineer striding purposefully towards him. The overgrown rodent was much taller than the captain, and made to appear even more massive by his swirling yellow robes and the hulking brass apparatus strapped to his back. Wholly inured to the weight of his armour, Venusto arrived in front of the Ratman and immediately stepped nimbly to one side. Goltramic was bewildered, still clutching the smoking, now useless rocket tube. When Venusto's vicious cut was made, it sliced deeply, through fur, flesh and ribs. Goltramic fell to the ground, the great weight of his many burdens speeding his collapse, then breathed his last as Venusto hauled the blade up and thrust it through his chest to scrape past the copper contraptions and plunge into the grassy ground beneath. The captain took a deep breath, yanked the blade free, then shouted, "Next!" before running into the trees which lay between him and the engine. From over the river, the marshal watched. Peering through the trees, Venusto had penetrated at the dark shape moving noisily upon the other side. He immediately realised two things. First, the captain would have to be lucky indeed to reach the engine, as fully armoured fellows rarely fared well in a sprint through the woods. And secondly, he and his halberdiers could not cross by the bridge, not if they were to have any real chance of reaching the engine. On the Campogrottans' far right, the mounted crossbowmen had made their way as best they could between the trees and the huge mob of slaves, hoping to find a way to catch the bombard. Those upon the front left of the body, who could see the engine, had high hopes of reaching it, for it lurched and careened most ungainly as it moved over the rougher ground malformed by the tree roots, like a badly trimmed ship might sail in choppy waters, crankily heeling over for too long and too far. Indeed, it looked like it might itself be the author of its own demise, for if it were to keel over, it certainly would not be firing anything that day. Perrette and the Brabançon crossed the bridge, but then she raised her hand to halt them. She knew, if they rode any further, they would put themselves between the crossbowmen and the engine, preventing another shot, which would be a shame considering their previous volley had done so much to discourage it. Besides, from here her riders could shoot, and she could conjure more magic. There was no need to move on, especially when that would almost certainly mean that she and her companions were hit from two sides by a veritable horde of uomini ratto. She did not know it, but her caution caused the dwarven cannoneers' cursing to redouble, for now the Brabançon riders blocked any glimpse of the enemy they might otherwise have had. Kissing the ruby ring she wore on her right hand, she released its magic and sent several fireballs curling towards the engine. But the etheric winds were weakened by the enemy's will, and all dissipated before reaching their target. Annoyed by the sight, she allowed her anger to add a sharp edge to her own incantation, and conjured more fireballs, this time of her own volition. One alone reached the engine, bursting to send sparks washing over it. An attendant fell, squealing in agony, his waxen robes ablaze, his squeals ceasing suddenly when the copper tank on his back popped. Perrette cursed, for the engine was still moving. Worse still, she was horrified to see that the paths of several stray fireballs and the volley of quarrels from the crossbowmen had crossed, diverting most of the missiles to spin wildly into the ground. The crossbowmen's third shot had thus failed completely. Neither she, her riders, nor the Campagna's crossbowmen had managed to stop the engine. Nor could Captain Venusto, for as he emerged from the trees, the engine was picking up pace, and just before he could reach it to land a blow, he was tumbled by a tree root. The engineer at the wheel's rear knew his mechanical ward was closer to catastrophe than ever before. Barely any attendants were left to assist its passage, and the driver at the heart of the wheel seemed to have finally perished during the shower of fireballs that had washed over and through the huge wheel. The engineer alone remained to steer the bombard, which would take all his strength, perhaps requiring more than he had to give. And if the bombard was still able to fire, then he could only hope that he and those attendants who survived were up to the task. The regiments here to guard the engine, however, had little understanding of its precarious state, and now launched charges intended to ensure its further progress. They could not allow the Brabançons and the fire wizard to continue their pursuit, nor could they risk another shot from the crossbowmen. And so, as the slaves hurtled into the foot soldiers behind the painted purvasers, the guard regiment began its charge against the riders. Several slaves perished from the crossbowmen's countershot, but such was the size of the mob that their demise went entirely unnoticed by either friend or foe. Like the arrival of a heavy wave upon a beach, they crashed against the purvasers. Then they set about the bloody work of blades, claws, and teeth. So busy were they in slaughter that not one slave noticed the Brabançon riders' flight across the bridge. Of course the guard regiment were fully aware, for they had taken only 2 steps before the enemy was off, away and out of reach. In truth, Pirette had little say in the matter. Weakened as she was by her conjurings, and wounded by the magical flame she had earlier failed to master, she simply went along with the riders, as a jumble of instructions tumbled at her. "This way, my lady! Come, now!" and "We must flee!" The riders had not come here to sacrifice themselves as martyrs to Campogrotta's cause, nor, after all they had been through, not least witnessing the slaughter of almost every other Brabançon soldier at Rivola, did they intend to throw away their lives for the sake of foolish pride. Most of all, perhaps, they could not allow their beloved lady to die. Indeed, they would ride away, regroup, and when the enemy was far enough behind that they could think, then they would decide what was for the best. As the bombard rolled on between the 2 woods, the engineer, despite his mask, could suddenly taste the poisonous vapours leaking from the grenado, and feel the sting of the etheric heat as it wormed its way into the material world to become sharp tendrils of real heat. The last of the attendants stumbled in pain as they tried to keep up, while 2 of the plague monks and 2 more of the Gisellas close by succumbed to the surging toxicity of the unstable orb within the bombard's barrel. Captain Venusto also stumbled as he raised himself after his fall, clutching at a branch with his steel-gauntleted hand to prevent himself from falling. There he hung for several moments, wheezing as his head swam, using his great sword like a staff to aid his standing. The engineer's throat was burning, his eyes pouring tears that misted up the tinted glass of his mask's lenses. He realised the pained screeching he could hear close by was emanating from between his own clenched teeth. Somewhere, in the deepest recesses of his fevered mind, a quiet voice declared, "So this is the end." The slaves brutally mauled the crossbowmen, so that only a handful escaped the rusted blades to perish instead in the river water. The Gisellas on the hill cheered when at last their bullets hit home, and tore 2 riders from their saddles, while a third was thrown hard to the ground when another bullet shattered his mount's head. But then they cursed as the remaining riders simply rode on after the bombard. Meanwhile, a newly arrived regiment of Carrickborgo quarrellers were marching up to the river's edge, being part of Nahak, the Thane of Dravaz's Campogrotta contingent, there to further threaten the bombard's demise. Desperate, yet also glad he had left off most of his armour, the Campagna's marshal led his men into the rushing waters, where no less than a dozen sank to their deaths. Somehow, he knew he must reach the war machine. Whatever it did, the enemy were obviously deadly determined to do it. He could even see the rat men were dropping around it, and he could feel the awful aura it exuded. If the machine merely reached the river, there to plunge to its ruin, the waters would likely run poisonous for many a league, perhaps even to the sea, and a vast throng could die as a consequence. The city of Campogrotta itself could also be poisoned. As the dwarf quarrellers prepared their crossbows for a shot, the engine was decelerating, its warpstone-heated tanks leaking spark-speckled steam from several ruptures. Again, the wheel lurched wildly to one side, which the engineer only just managed to correct using all his remaining strength. It was now obvious to him that the engine would not reach the river's edge, from where all the engineers had agreed it should definitely be within range of the city. Worse still, if the dwarven quarrellers were to shoot, or the horsemen caught up from behind, it might never shoot at all. He managed to transform his screeching into a shouted command, and very simple it was too, being just, "Now! Now! Now! Now!" Yanking the brake handle to full lock, he slowed the engine to a stop, then jumped down from the platform. He hit the ground hard, his legs buckling beneath him, and as his body thumped down, his mask slipped. One involuntary gasp of the foully metallic air was all it took to end his life in that moment. 2 attendants remained, of which only one retained the wit and strength necessary to make his way to the Bombard's rear, where its carriage was connected to the driving wheel. He scrambled up onto the carriage so that he could reach the firing hammer. The other surviving attendant was reeling around, utterly lost in confusion, attempting to recite some rhyming instructions on how to fire that he had learned several weeks previously. As he mumbled, it dawned on him that the words were wrong. Somehow they had melted inside his mind and no longer rhymed. He had to make them rhyme again. The first attendant, however, still retained enough presence of mind to act. He yanked at a little chain to release the preventer pin, then tore off the cracked leather stall covering the flint shard. Something about the procedure seemed wrong, particularly the order in which he was supposed to do things, but with most of his brain screaming in pain, he couldn't sift out what was nagging at him. Fumbling in his apron's pouch, he pulled out an iron tool. It was not the tool he wanted, but one of its edges would suffice for scraping, which is what he now began to do, clearing away the gobbet of hardened wax protecting the touch hole from damp. One of his eyes wouldn't open, so nothing was quite as near or far as he thought it was, but he managed to break the wax off. His fingertips fizzled as he scraped so close to the barrel. Thrusting his hands back into the pouch, he began pulling things out and discarding them. The fourth thing he dropped was a small powder flask, which clattered down between the carriage parts to the ground below. Whilst grabbing at the fifth item, he realised it was the flask he needed, so he stretched to reach down between the timber and iron parts, his feet clutching as tight as his hand to keep a hold, while he strained down with the other hand. As the tip of his middle finger's claw scratched at the flask, his head was swimming, and the flask apparently spinning, so he stopped for a moment to steady himself. As he hung there, he sensed that the Bombard's carriage was, almost imperceptibly, tipping sideways. Painfully, he twisted to peer back, and saw the wheel behind was leaning precariously to one side, on the edge of toppling. As it was still linked by an iron hook to the Bombard, it was in the process of capsizing that too. Straining his one good eye, he could see the wheel's starboard rim tread was still rotating, albeit very slowly, as it strained to grind through the mud, thus causing the whole to tip. That slight motion spelled his doom. "Never stop," they had told him and the others. "Never ever stop," they had repeated ad nauseum. Then he remembered that amongst some confusingly contrary instructions concerning what to do if the Bombard did stop, someone had said, "And whatever you do, never stop on soft ground." Blinking the one eye he could, the other seemed to be dissolving and dribbling into his cheek fur. He squinted down to locate the flask. It was lying in the mud. He stretched out his arm again. The wheel was now leaning over more than seemed possible, but the great weight of the attached Bombard was apparently sufficient, momentarily at least, to delay its full fall. Nevertheless, the Bombard itself was now tipping over, ever so slightly more with each passing moment. Using his claw, he hooked the flask's leather strap and lifted it. Hauling himself back up to the pan beneath the touch hole, he commenced pouring the black powder. It spilled in and immediately began to spill out. The bombard was obviously leaning over much further than he thought. "More then," he muttered, and poured the entire contents of the flask into the pan. Suddenly, the bombard's carriage lurched, one side now lifting right up off the ground, as a great groaning sound came from the fatal connection joining it to the wheel. The bombard was going over, right now. "Never stop," they had said, more than any other instruction. "Never stop." As the ground began to rush towards him, he pulled the hammer's release, and the entire field of battle was instantly engulfed in flames. After. Very few survived the fight at the bridge. Very, very few. One of the crossbow horsemen was found later, without his horse, sobbing on the southern bank of the river, more than a league from the bridge. He never spoke again, and died 2 weeks later. The marshal, soaking wet, red-faced and wheezing, with no armour about him whatsoever, was helped to the city's southern gate by 2 of the halberdiers. No other halberdiers returned. Only 4 dwarven crossbowmen returned, each one with the same crazed expression, but none of the cannoneers. Perrette and her riders had been just far enough away to survive, although all needed tending by the city's chirurgeons to rebalance their badly skewed bodily humours. All this was just the start of the city's new misery.